2:16 in the afternoon. The Central Mediterranean Sea. USS Leyte Gulf was already dying, though the crew did not know it yet. The cruiser had been in a state of relaxed readiness for 6 days, patrolling the waters between Sicily and the North African coast. The water around the hull was a calm, liquid sapphire, reflecting a sun that felt too bright for what was coming. The air on the open bridge wings smelled of salt spray and the faint, metallic tang of the massive ANSPY-1 radar arrays. Then, the world shattered. Deep below the waterline, the first acoustic signature blossomed on the sonar screen in the Combat Information Center. It was a high-frequency scream, the unmistakable sound of a mechanical predator. "Torpedo in the water," the sonar technician shouted, his voice cracking with the sudden surge of adrenaline. The words were still hanging in the air when the first strike occurred. A Russian 53mm wake-homing torpedo slammed into the aft port quarter of the ship. The impact was not just a sound. It was a physical wall of pressure that defied description. The warhead punched through the double-bottom steel like a hammer through thin glass, detonating with a force that sent a shockwave through every deck plate and every bone in every sailor. The explosion erupted inside the hull, vaporizing fuel and seawater instantly into a searing cloud of superheated gas. The ship bucked. 9,000 tons of steel were lifted, nearly 3 meters out of the water before gravity reclaimed the vessel. Men were thrown against bulkheads like rag dolls. Heavy equipment, bolted to the decks for years, tore loose from its mountings and became lethal projectiles. The smell of the sea was gone, in a heartbeat, replaced by the choking, acrid stench of burnt copper, vaporized oil, and ozone. On the bridge, the commanding officer was slammed into the main radar console. His vision went white, then bled into a hazy gray. His ears rang, with a high, thin whistle that blotted out the screams of the crew. When he managed to open his eyes, the deck beneath him was no longer level. It was tilting, a slow and sickening roll to the left. The ship was taking on water, and it was taking it on with a violent hunger. "Report damage," the captain gasped, his voice thin and ragged as he pulled himself up by the edge of the chart table. The reply was a chaotic chorus of alarms that sounded like a funeral dirge for the cruiser. Red emergency lights bathed the bridge in a bloody, rhythmic glow. The ship's intercom crackled with static, then died, leaving the officers in a vacuum of uncertainty. Below the waterline, in the aft engine room, the scene was a nightmare of escaping steam and black oil. The torpedo had severed the port propeller shaft, and the housing had been shredded into jagged ribbons of metal. Seawater, under the immense pressure of the Mediterranean depths, was roaring through the breach. It was a green, violent river that nothing could stop, moving with enough force to strip the paint off the bulkheads. In the first 60 seconds after impact, the USS Leyte Gulf took on more than 400 tons of water. The ship was a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, a masterpiece of naval engineering built for high-intensity war. But no ship was built to swim with its guts ripped open and its spine twisted. The cruiser groaned, a deep and metallic sound of overstressed steel that vibrated through the souls of everyone on board. Somewhere in the dark, cold water behind them, the hunter was watching. A Russian Kilo-class submarine, running silent and deep, was already turning for a second pass. The crew of the Leyte Gulf had exactly 10 minutes to stabilize their ship and find a way to fight back. If they failed, the beautiful blue Mediterranean would become their final resting place. The executive officer grabbed a handrail to keep from sliding across the tilting bridge deck. "Engine room is flooding," he shouted over the roar of the fire alarms. "Steering is unresponsive. We are dead in the water, Captain." The commanding officer looked at the primary sonar display. It was blank, the glass cracked. The explosion had likely shattered the bow-mounted transducers. They were blind. They were bleeding. They were alone. The heat in the bridge began to rise as the air conditioning failed and the smell of smoke grew thicker. The sun continued to beat down on the deck, outside, indifferent to the struggle for survival beginning below the waves. "Get the damage control teams to the aft." "Engine room," the captain ordered, his voice regaining its steel. "I want every pump running. I want that hole sealed before we lose the list." But the sound of the incoming water was louder than his voice. It was the sound of the ocean claiming what belonged to it. The trap was closed, and the Mediterranean was no longer a highway. It was a graveyard. 2:17 in the afternoon. Main engine room 2. The space was a vertical canyon of scorched aluminum and screaming pipes. The water was no longer just a leak. It was a physical presence, a cold and oily weight that rose past the knees of the damage control team in less than 3 minutes. The air was a thick, choking fog of atomized diesel fuel and high-pressure steam that hissed from shattered lines. The only light came from the flickering red glow of the emergency lanterns, casting long and jagged shadows against the bulkheads. "Get that shoring in place!" Chief Petty Officer Miller shouted, his voice barely audible, over the roar of the incoming Mediterranean. He was waist-deep in the rising tide, his hands slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and salt water. A 6-man team struggled with a heavy, 4-inch timber beam, trying to wedge it against a buckling hatch. The steel was groaning, a deep and rhythmic sound of metal being pushed to its absolute breaking point by the weight of the sea. The water was black, stained by the thousands of gallons of fuel oil that had spilled from the ruptured tanks. It felt like ice against their skin, a sharp and numbing contrast to the searing heat of the steam pipes overhead. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of chemical fire and ancient salt, a scent that clung to the back of their throats and made every breath a struggle. Every time the ship rolled to the left, the water surged, slamming the sailors against the sharp edges of the turbine casings. "The patch is failing," a young sailor yelled, pointing to a jagged tear in the hull plating. A piece of the Russian torpedo's outer casing was still wedged in the gap, acting like a serrated knife that cut through the rubber gaskets they tried to apply. Water jetted through the opening with enough pressure to strip the skin from a man's arm. It hit the opposite bulkhead with a sound like a continuous gunshot, spray filling the air until visibility was less than 2 feet. Miller grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and waded toward the breach. He swung with everything he had, the heavy iron head slamming into the wooden shoring with a dull and wet thud. The wood splintered, but it held for a second. Then, the ship took another heavy roll. The pressure outside doubled as the hull dipped deeper into the swells. The timber snapped with a sound like a rifle crack, and the water surged forward, knocking the entire team off their feet. They were swimming now, a desperate scramble to find handholds in a room that was rapidly becoming a steel coffin. The water reached the level of the main electrical switchboards. A series of blue sparks erupted, bright and violent, dancing across the surface of the oily water like miniature lightning bolts. The smell of ozone and burning insulation filled the cramped space, mixing with the acrid stink of the diesel. "Abandon the space," the order came, over the emergency headset, crackling with static. "Chief Miller, get your men out of there. We are sealing the hatch from the deck above." Miller looked at his team. They were exhausted, their faces pale and streaked with black oil. They had fought for every inch of the engine room, but the ocean was winning. The Mediterranean was reclaiming the space, 1 cubic meter at a time. They scrambled up the vertical ladder, their boots slipping on the oily rungs. The water followed them, a rising dark mirror that reflected the red emergency lights. As the last man cleared the coaming, Miller grabbed the heavy steel hatch and swung it shut. The wheel spun, the dogs locking into place with a series of metallic clanks that signaled the end of main engine room 2. The silence that followed was heavy and wrong, broken only by the muffled, distant thudding of the water against the other side of the steel. The ship was now officially a casualty. With the engine room flooded, the Leyte Gulf had lost half its power and its primary steering control. They were listing 10 degrees to the port side, a permanent tilt that made every movement on the ship a tactical challenge. The heat on the upper decks was already becoming unbearable as the ventilation systems remained dead. Every sailor on the ship could feel the list in their inner ear, a constant reminder that the center of gravity was shifting toward the abyss. On the deck above, The damage control teams sat in the passageway, gasping for air. Their uniforms were ruined, soaked in the grime of a battle they had lost. But there was no time for rest. Somewhere beneath them, the Russian submarine was still there. A silent shadow in the deep. It had tasted blood, and it was unlikely to leave the job half-finished. The cruiser was no longer a hunter. It was a target. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the water that looked like hammered brass. But for the men inside the steel hull, the world was narrowing down to the sound of their own breathing and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a hull under pressure. The first round was over, but the war for the Mediterranean depths had only just begun. 2:21 in the afternoon, 300 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean. The Russian Kilo-class submarine moved through the deep like a ghost in a tomb. Inside the pressure hull, the air was thick and tasted of recycled oxygen and stale cigarette smoke. The only light came from the dim red glow of the battle stations, painting the faces of the crew in bloody shadows. Silence was their only armor. No one spoke. No one moved, unless it was absolutely necessary. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the electric motors driving the single seven-bladed propeller. It was a whisper in a world of silence, a sound that the Americans called the black hole for its ability to disappear into the background noise of the sea. Captain Second-Rank Volkov stood near the periscope well, his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed on the sonar repeaters. He was a man of cold stone, a hunter who had spent 20 years learning the thermal layers and acoustic canyons of these waters. "Target is settling," the sonar operator whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. He pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. Through the sensitive hydrophones mounted on the submarine's hull, he could hear the death throes of the USS Leyte Gulf. It was a symphony of destruction, the sharp, metallic pops of rivets shearing, the deep groans of overstressed steel, and the chaotic roar of water rushing into empty spaces. To a sonar man, it was the sound of victory. "She is dead in the water, Comrade Captain," the operator continued. "Propeller noise has ceased. I hear emergency pumps, but they are losing the battle. The list is increasing." Volkov nodded slowly. He did not smile. In the silent world of submarine warfare, professional respect was often paid to the enemy you were about to sink. The Americans were good, but they had been caught in a transition, their radar eyes looking at the horizon while the steel blade was already at their throat. "Come to course 095, Volkov ordered, his voice low and steady. "Slow to 2 knots. Maintain depth at 100 meters for the final approach." The submarine banked with a heavy, graceful motion. The crew worked with the practiced ease of men who knew that one dropped wrench or one slammed hatch would mean their own destruction. The Mediterranean was a crowded sea, and while the Leyte Gulf was wounded, her sisters and her aircraft would be coming. The hunter had to finish the kill and vanish before the cavalry arrived. The air in the control room was growing warmer. The smell of sweat and hydraulic fluid was sharp, a human scent in a machine-driven world. Volkov looked at the weapon status board. Torpedo tubes 3 and 4 were flooded and equalized. Inside the tubes sat 2 more 53mm heavy torpedoes, their electronic brains already programmed. With the acoustic signature of the listing cruiser, they were the finishers. Range to target 4,000 meters, the fire control officer reported. "We are in the baffles. She cannot see us. She cannot hear us." The submarine was positioned directly behind the cruiser, in the blind spot, created by the ship's own hull and the turbulence of its wake. It was the classic predatory position. The Leyte Gulf was like a wounded whale, and the Kilo-class was the shark circling for the final bite. Volkov reached out and touched the cold steel of the periscope housing. He could feel the vibration of the sea against the hull. He knew that on the surface, the sun was bright and the water was blue. He knew that men were dying in the dark, oily water of the cruiser's engine room. But here, in the red-lit silence, there was only the geometry of the attack. "Final bearing set," the fire control officer whispered. "Solution is 98%. Request permission to fire. Volkov checked the clock on the bulkhead. Every second they stayed this close was a risk. The American cruiser might be blind, but her sonar technicians were trained to listen for the faint click of a torpedo tube opening. He waited for the ship to groan again, a loud acoustic masking event that would hide the sound of his own weapon launch. There it was. A massive internal bulkhead on the Leyte Gulf gave way, sending a booming resonance through the water. Fire Tube 3, Volkov commanded. The submarine shuddered as high-pressure air forced the massive torpedo out into the current. The weapon's motor ignited 6 seconds later, a high-pitched whine that raced away from the submarine at 45 knots. The ghost had spoken. Now, it was only a matter of time. 2:22 in the afternoon. The Combat Information Center of USS Leyte Gulf. The room was a tomb of blue and red light, flickering every time the ship groaned under the weight of the incoming sea. The air was stale and heavy, smelling of ozone from shorted consoles and the sharp, metallic stink of communal fear. The ship's primary sonar system, the AN/SQQ-89, was crippled. The bow dome was a ruin of shattered composite and crushed transducers, silenced by the first Russian strike. But the sailors in the dark were not giving up. They were hunting with their ears, using the remaining passive sensors along the hull. "I have nothing but clutter," sonar technician second class Rodriguez shouted, his hands pressing his headset against his ears. He was leaning at a sharp angle to compensate for the 10-degree list of the deck. The sound in his ears was a nightmare of acoustic violence. The flooding in the aft engine room was creating a massive wall of noise. It was a continuous, deafening roar of water under pressure, mixing with the sharp, metallic pops of the ship's internal bulkheads as they buckled. To his sensors, the Leyte Gulf was screaming, and that scream was masking everything else in the Mediterranean. "Rodriguez, find me that boat," the tactical action officer ordered. The officer stood behind the sonar console, his face pale in the ghost light of the emergency displays. "He is in our baffles. He is sitting right in the blind spot of our own wake and the flooding noise. If he fires again, we won't see it until it is too late." The cruiser was effectively deafened by its own injuries. Every time the emergency pumps kicked in, they sent a rhythmic thud through the hull that washed out the delicate frequencies of a submarine's electric motor. Rodriguez closed his eyes, trying to tune out the sound of his own ship dying. He filtered the frequencies, sliding the digital gates on his screen to block out the low-end rumble of the flooding. He was looking for the fingerprint, the specific, high-frequency whine of a Russian torpedo's counter-rotating propellers. Then, he heard it. It was faint, a needle-thin whistle cutting through the roar of the waterfall. It was not a submarine. It was a weapon. "Torpedo in the water!" Rodriguez screamed, his voice cracking the tension in the room. Bearing 185. Range, 2,000 yards. It is a high-speed run. The Combat Information Center erupted into a controlled frenzy. "Weapons free on countermeasures," the tactical action officer shouted. "Launch the Nixie. Fire the acoustic decoys. Hard starboard rudder. Get us off this bearing." On the listing, salt-sprayed deck of the cruiser, the Mark 36 decoy launchers fired. 4 canisters shot into the air with a series of sharp, pneumatic thuds. They arched over the side, hitting the sapphire water, with white splashes. Instantly, the decoys began to scream. They were small electronic devices designed to broadcast a massive acoustic signature, mimicking the sound of the cruiser's twin propellers. The goal was to create a ghost ship in the water, a false target, to lure the Russian torpedo away from the vulnerable, listing stern. Behind the ship, the Nixie acoustic decoy was reeled out on a long cable. It hummed with a powerful pulse, sending out a signal that matched the Leyte Gulf's exact noise profile. The water behind the ship became a chaotic mess of competing sounds. The Russian torpedo, a mechanical shark with an electronic brain, was now facing a choice. It had to decide which sound was the real prey and which was the ghost. Range, 1,000 yards, Rodriguez reported. His sweat was dripping onto the console. The torpedo is reacting. It's turning. It's hunting the decoys. On the digital display, the red line representing the incoming weapon began to curve. It was swinging away from the cruiser's center line, veering toward the cloud of noise created by the Mark 36 canisters. The ship groaned as the helmsman struggled to turn the rudder. With only one engine functional and the aft steering gear damaged, the Leyte Gulf moved with agonizing slowness. The cruiser felt heavy, a wounded giant trying to sidestep a killer's blade. The list increased to 12 degrees as the ship fought the turn. The deck, plates vibrating with the strain. 500 yards, Rodriguez whispered. The room went silent. Every man in the Combat Information Center gripped a handrail or a console edge. They were waiting for the impact. They were waiting to see if their decoys had worked, or if the Mediterranean was about to claim the rest of their lives. The sound of the torpedo's propellers was now so loud, it could be heard through the hull without a headset. It was a shrieking, metallic whistle that seemed to fill the entire ship. Suddenly, the pitch changed. The torpedo's sonar had locked onto the most powerful signal, the decoy. The weapon accelerated, its electronic brain satisfied that it had found the target. 300 yards behind the ship, the torpedo struck the Nixie decoy. The explosion was a muffled, deep-water thud that vibrated through the cruiser's hull. A massive column of white water erupted from the sea, 300 yards off the port quarter. The shockwave hit the Leyte Gulf, rattling the remaining radar masts and sending a fresh surge of water into the engine room. But the hull remained intact. The second strike had missed. "Target destroyed the decoy," Rodriguez said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We are clear. For now." The tactical action officer didn't relax. He looked at the empty sonar screen, where the Russian submarine should have been. He's still out there, and he knows our countermeasures are limited. The sun was lower, now, painting the Mediterranean in shades of bruised purple and orange. The air in the Combat Information Center was cooling as the emergency. Power flickered again. The cruiser had survived the second bite, but they were still dead in the water, and the hunter was already reloading his tubes. The shadows were growing longer, and in the deep, the silent ghost was getting ready to finish the job. 2:30 in the afternoon, the flight deck of USS Leyte Gulf, the MH-60 Sierra helicopter, sat precariously on the non-skid surface. The deck was tilted at a sharp 12-degree angle to port. The sea below was a churning mess of white foam and sapphire water, triggered by the ship's erratic movement. The air was thick with the scream of twin engines and the heavy, sweet scent of JP-5 jet fuel. "Chains clear," the flight deck officer signaled, his yellow jersey flapping violently in the rotor wash. The pilot fought the controls to keep the aircraft from sliding off the edge of the listing ship. The helicopter lifted, clawing for altitude against a hot Mediterranean wind that smelled of salt and diesel. It cleared the safety netting by less than 3 feet, banked hard, and leveled out over the open water. Inside the cabin, the sensor operator lowered the dipping sonar into the depths. "I have a solid contact," the operator shouted over the headset. "Submarine is moving to a new firing position, bearing 205. Range 3,000 yards." On the bridge of the Leyte Gulf, the captain didn't hesitate. The time for defense was over. The cruiser was wounded, but its teeth were still sharp. The trigger was squeezed. The Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted on the forward deck. A VL-ASROC missile shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors standing nearest to the bridge windows. The smoke rose incinerated, a dense white column that blotted out the horizon for 3 full seconds. The rocket tore into the sky, carrying a lightweight torpedo toward the calculated position of the Russian hunter. 2 miles away, the rocket motor burned out and the payload separated. The Mark 54 torpedo deployed its parachute, splashed into the water, and activated its active sonar. The weapon found the Kilo-class submarine instantly. The warhead punched straight through the upper casing of the submarine's sail, detonating against the pressure hull. The explosion was a muffled, bone-shaking thud that sent a massive pillar of white water and black debris 10 meters into the air. Steel fragments were driven deep into the submarine's internal systems. The pressure hull did not breach, but the shockwave shattered the internal light fixtures and severed the hydraulic lines for the diving planes. The Kilo-class submarine groaned under the massive physical blow. The vessel rolled hard to the starboard side, the crew inside thrown against the sharp edges of their consoles. The captain of the Russian boat screamed for an emergency blow, his voice lost in the fast screech of escaping high-pressure air. The submarine began to pitch upward, its nose rising at a dangerous angle. Upward, its nose rising at a dangerous angle as it struggled to maintain depth. Electrical fires broke out in the forward torpedo room, filling the cramped space with thick, toxic smoke. Black oil and air bubbles rose to the surface, marking the spot of the impact. The sea was suddenly filled with the sound of groaning metal and the frantic hiss of compressed air. The hunter had become the prey, and the water was stained with the evidence of its injury. The helicopter circled above, its sensors tracking the wounded ghost as it clawed for the surface. The first blood had been drawn, but the silence of the Mediterranean was gone, replaced by the roar of a battle that was far from over. 2:35 in the afternoon. The bridge of the USS Leyte Gulf. The captain wiped sweat from his eyes with a soot-stained sleeve. The ship remained at a sharp 12-degree list. Every movement on the bridge required a firm grip on a handrail. The air was a thick blanket of heat, nearly 100 degrees. It smelled of scorched paint, hydraulic fluid, and salt. "Bring the starboard engine to 2/3, the captain ordered. The deck beneath their feet began to vibrate with a violent, rhythmic growl. The single functioning propeller clawed at the water. The cruiser was no longer trying to be quiet. It was screaming. It was a picket line of pure acoustic energy. The captain was using the damaged engine to create a wall of sound. He wanted to mask the helicopter's movements. He wanted the Russian captain to think the cruiser was making a run for it. The sun hung low, a red coin against a purple sky. The Mediterranean was darkening, the waves capped with white foam. Inside the hull, the pumps continued their desperate, metallic thudding. The ship was a beacon of noise in a silent sea. 2 miles away, the wounded Kilo-class submarine was listening. The Russian captain heard the roar of the American turbine. It sounded like a challenge. It sounded like an opening. He ordered his boat to turn toward the noise. The submarine banked heavily, its damaged diving planes groaning. He did not know he was walking into a secondary kill zone. The trap was set. The bait was 9,000 tons of listing steel. The sonar operator on the Leyte Gulf watched the screen. The passive sensors were flooded with their own engine noise, but the helicopter above had a clean view. "Target is committing," the pilot reported over the radio. "He is turning into the wake. He is coming for the kill." The captain of the Leyte Gulf tightened his grip on the console. His ship was broken, but it was not defeated. The vibration of the engine felt like a heartbeat. They were dragging the hunter into the light. The Mediterranean depths were about to witness the final exchange. 3:45 in the afternoon. The final mile of the engagement. The Mediterranean Sea was a deep, bruised violet as the sun touched the horizon. On the bridge of the USS Leyte Gulf, the air was a stagnant wall of heat and the smell of ozone. The list had stabilized at 12 degrees, but the ship felt sluggish, a wounded animal waiting for the final blow. Every man on the bridge was drenched in sweat, their eyes red from the sting of smoke and salt. 2 miles away, the Russian Kilo-class submarine was a dying predator. Inside the Russian boat, the red battle lights flickered and died, replaced by the weak, greenish glow of chemical sticks. The air was toxic, a thick soup of battery acid fumes and the smell of scorched insulation. Water sprayed from a dozen minor leaks, the sound like 1,000 angry snakes in the dark. Captain Volkov leaned against the periscope housing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "One final shot," Volkov whispered in the dark. He did not need a perfect solution. He had the roar of the American cruiser's engine to guide him. Fire tube 4, manual override. The trigger was squeezed. The final 53mm torpedo shrieked out of the tube. The high-pressure air blast shook the submarine to its core, a physical shock that knocked the remaining crew to the deck. The weapon's motor ignited instantly, a high-pitched, metallic scream that tore through the water at 50 knots. The wake homing sensor locked onto the massive acoustic signature of the Leyte Gulf's struggling starboard engine. At the same moment, the MH-60 Sierra helicopter banked hard over the submarine's last known position. The sensor operator saw the thermal bloom of the torpedo launch on his display. "Vampire! Vampire! Torpedo in the water! We are dropping now!" The helicopter's weapon rack cycled. The Mark 54 lightweight torpedo fell from the pylon. It hit the water with a clean entry, the parachute fluttering away like a dead bird. The weapon activated its active sonar, a series of high-frequency pings that sounded like a hammer, hitting a steel pipe. It found the Kilo-class submarine in less than 4 seconds. The Mark 54 torpedo reached the submarine first. The warhead punched straight through the forward torpedo room casing, driving 600 pounds of high explosive into the Russian boat's pressure hull. The detonation was a white-hot flash that bleached the dark water for a fraction of a second. The explosion did not just break the hull, it shredded it. The forward 20 feet of the submarine disappeared in a cloud of pulverized steel and vaporized seawater. Inside the Kilo, the end was instantaneous for the men in the bow. The pressure wave compressed the air in the boat until it reached the temperature of the sun. The hull groaned once, a massive and final sound of metal being crushed by the weight of the Mediterranean. The submarine buckled in the middle, the stern rising high into the water before the pressure hull gave way completely. Implosion followed, a deep-sea thud that sent a shockwave felt by the sailors on the Leyte Gulf's deck. But the Russian torpedo was still running. It ignored the death of its mothership, its electronic brain focused only on the churning water behind the cruiser. Impact, in 5 seconds, Rodriguez screamed from the sonar console. In the Combat Information Center. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" The Russian torpedo slammed into the cruiser's stern, directly into the rudder housing. The warhead detonated against the already weakened steel of the aft section. The explosion blew the remaining rudder assembly clear, off the ship, sending 3 tons of bronze spinning into the deep. The hull plating near the engine room was ripped, open for another 10 meters. A massive fireball erupted from the stern, a column of orange flame and black smoke that rose 50 meters into the air. The Leyte Gulf bucked forward, the force of the explosion throwing men from their feet for the 3rd time that day. The ship's stern settled deeper into the water. The sound was a deafening roar of fire and rushing ocean, a chaotic symphony of destruction. Black oil began to pour from the new breach, spreading across the surface of the sea in a thick, iridescent carpet. Silence followed the roar. The Russian submarine was gone, leaving only a rising field of debris and a massive oil slick that smoothed the waves. The cruiser was still afloat, but the fire at the stern was out of control, feeding on the spilled fuel. The smell of burning rubber and scorched metal was overwhelming, a thick and heavy scent that blotted out the sea air. On the bridge, the captain pulled himself up from the deck. He looked out at the burning stern, then at the empty sea where the submarine had been. The Mediterranean was quiet again, but it was the silence of a graveyard. The heat from the fire washed over the bridge, a searing reminder of how close they had come to the end. The engagement was over. The hunter was dead, and the prey was broken. The red sun finally slipped below the horizon, leaving the burning ship alone in the gathering dark. The only sound was the crackle of the flames and the distant, rhythmic thud of a single pump still fighting the sea. 3:50 in the afternoon. The Mediterranean was a mirror of dark oil and fire. The Russian submarine was a memory, crushed by the weight of the deep. Only a few pieces of debris remained on the surface to mark its grave. But the USS Leyte Gulf was dying a slower death. The fire in the aft steering gear was out of control. It fed on the hydraulic fluid and the shattered remains of the deck. The flames were a brilliant, angry orange against the darkening sky. The heat was so intense, it warped the steel of the flight deck. The air carried the sharp, chemical bite of burning insulation. Damage control teams moved like ghosts through the thick, black smoke. They wore heavy silver suits that reflected the dancing firelight. Their breath came in ragged gasps through their oxygen masks. The water from their hoses hissed and turned to steam instantly. The deck beneath their boots was hot enough to melt rubber. Below the waterline, the new breach was a jagged, 10-meter wound. The sea rushed in with a terrifying, rhythmic roar. The cruiser groaned as the list increased to 15 degrees. Everything not bolted down slid across the deck with a metallic crash. The ship felt heavy and tired under the weight of the water. In the Combat Information Center, the emergency lights flickered and died. The sailors worked by the pale light of handheld lanterns. The floor was slick, with a mixture of seawater and spilled oil. They could hear the fire roaring through the vents above them. It was a sound like a freight train passing through the ship. "The aft bulkhead is buckling," a young sailor reported, his voice trembling. "The pressure is too much. The steel is starting to tear." The captain stood on the bridge, his hands white-knuckled on the railing. He could feel the ship's center of gravity shifting toward the abyss. The Mediterranean was no longer a battlefield. It was a predator. The weight of the ocean was pulling at the stern with a relentless grip. Every wave that hit the ship sent a fresh surge into the engine room. The pump motors were screaming, their bearings beginning to fail. The smell of hot metal and salt spray filled the cramped passageways. They were losing the fight against the rising tide. The fire leaped higher, licking at the base of the aft radar mast. A shower of sparks blew across the deck, landing in the oil slick. The sea itself seemed to catch fire for a brief, terrifying moment. The smoke rose in a column that could be seen for 20 miles. The USS Leyte Gulf was a beacon of desperation in the gathering dark. 4 in the afternoon. The Mediterranean sky was a bruise of purple and orange, keeping the USS Leyte Gulf from slipping into total darkness. The aircraft hovered 50 feet above the churning, oily water, its sensors locked on the cruiser's burning stern. The rotor wash was a violent, downward hammer of air that whipped the fire into a frenzy. But it was also clearing the thickest of the black smoke for the damage control teams on the deck below. Inside the cabin, the sensor operator was no longer looking for submarines. He was mapping the heat. "Bridge, Easy Rider, 7-2. The pilot's voice crackled over the emergency radio circuit. "We have a massive thermal spike in the aft steering compartment. The fire is spreading toward the magazine for the 5-inch gun. You have maybe 10 minutes before the temperature reaches the cook-off point." On the bridge, the captain leaned against the shattered glass of the forward window. The ship was now listing at 17 degrees. Every minute, the cruiser felt heavier, as if the Mediterranean was reaching up with invisible hands to pull the steel hull under. The kill chain had shifted. It was no longer about destroying the enemy. It was a chain of survival connecting the helicopter's eyes, the bridge's command, and the exhausted sailors in the fire-filled gut of the ship. "Chief Miller, do you copy?" the captain shouted into his handset. "We have a thermal threat to the aft magazine. You have to flood it, now." The response was a burst of static, then a coughing, ragged voice. "The valves are under 4 feet of water, Captain. The compartment is filled with toxic smoke. We can't reach the manual overrides." The helicopter pilot, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, watched the scene from above. Through her night vision goggles, the cruiser looked like a dying whale, wreathed in a halo of orange flame and white steam. She could see the oil slick spreading for miles, a black carpet that smoothed the waves but smelled of death. The Mediterranean was beautiful and indifferent, its deep blue depths waiting to swallow the billion-dollar warship. "Sensor, drop the dipping sonar," Jenkins ordered. "I want to hear what's happening inside that hull. Listen for the bulkheads." The sonar transducer splashed into the water and sank 30 feet. Instead of the rhythmic ping of a hunter, the operator heard the horrific sounds of a ship coming apart. It was a series of deep, metallic groans that vibrated through the water. It was the sound of rivets shearing under the pressure of thousands of tons of seawater. It was the sound of a spine being twisted by the weight of a listing deck. "The ship is twisting, Commander," the sensor operator whispered. "The aft section is structurally compromised. If that fire hits the magazine, the ship won't just sink, it will vanish." Jenkins banked the helicopter, the twin engines screaming as she fought the turbulence from the rising heat. "Bridge, we are moving into a hover over the aft deck. We are going to use our downwash to push the flames away from the magazine hatch. Get your men in there now." The helicopter moved with precision, the massive rotors acting like a giant fan. The air pressure was immense, pushing the wall of fire back just a few precious meters. On the deck, the damage control team saw the opening. They moved with the desperation of men who knew they were standing on a ticking bomb. They dragged a heavy, yellow fire hose toward the hatch, the water pressure nearly kicking them off the listing deck. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on their helmets instantly. The smell of burning rubber and scorched hair was everywhere. Miller reached the hatch. He threw his weight against the steel wheel, his boots slipping on the oily non-skid surface. The metal was so hot he could feel it through his heavy gloves. With a final, guttural scream, he turned the wheel. The dogs retracted with a series of sharp, metallic snaps. The hatch swung open, and a column of black, oily smoke erupted into the air, nearly knocking the team over. "Hose in. Flood it," Miller yelled. The water surged into the dark hole, a white torrent that hissed and roared as it hit the heated interior. The steam rose in a blinding cloud, momentarily swallowing the sailors and the deck. From the helicopter, it looked like the ship had exploded. Jenkins held the hover, her hands white-knuckled on the controls, waiting for the smoke to clear. 3 minutes passed. The thermal camera showed the bright white heat of the fire begin to dull into a deep, angry red. The temperature was dropping. The magazine was safe. But the price was more weight. The water they had pumped in was now added to the flooding. The cruiser groaned again, and the list increased to 18 degrees. "Bridge, the fire is suppressed," Jenkins reported, her voice shaking with fatigue. "But you are sitting very low in the water. Your freeboard at the stern is less than 2 meters. If the weather turns, you are going down." The stern captain looked out at the horizon. The last of the sun was gone. The world was a dark, cold place of salt and shadow. "We copy. Easy Rider. We are holding. Tell the fleet we are still here." The cruiser was a ruin, a collection of broken steel and exhausted men, but it was still afloat. The kill chain had held. The Mediterranean had been denied its prize for 1 more hour. 4:30 in the afternoon. The Mediterranean was a vast, cold shadow. The USS Leyte Gulf was no longer a warship. It was a dying island of steel. The list had reached 19 degrees, a terrifying angle that turned every bulkhead into a floor, and every floor into a wall. Inside the hull, the sound of the ocean was no longer a distant rumble. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding, the sound of 500 tons of water shifting with every swell. The ship groaned, a deep and vibrating scream of metal that could be felt in the teeth of every sailor on board. The captain stood on the bridge, his feet braced against the pedestal of the command chair. The ship's internal geometry was failing. Doors that should have swung free were jammed tight by the twisting of the frame. The air was a thick, wet fog of steam and the smell of cold, oily seawater. They had survived the foreign torpedoes, but they were losing the war against gravity. "Engineering. Bridge," the commander said, his voice a low rasp into the emergency headset. "We are at 19 degrees. If we hit 22, the center of gravity will be gone. We will capsize in less than 60 seconds." The response from the damage control center was a burst of static, followed by the voice of the senior officer. "The aft engineering compartment is completely lost, Commander. We are taking water faster than the emergency pumps can move it. The only way to stop the roll is a counterflood." A counterflood was the ultimate gamble. It meant intentionally letting the Mediterranean into the starboard side of the ship to balance the weight of the flooding on the port side. It would level the deck, but it would also sink the ship deeper into the water. The cruiser would be heavier, slower, and closer to the abyss. If the bulkheads between the compartments failed, the vessel would go down like a stone. "Do it," the commander ordered. "Flood the starboard forward void." Now, deep in the forward section of the vessel, a sailor turned a heavy brass wheel. The valve opened with a screech of unlubricated metal. The sea rushed into the empty void with a sound like a jet engine. The vessel shuddered, a long and violent vibration that ran from the bow to the stern. For a moment, nothing happened. The list remained at 19 degrees. The crew held their breath, clutching handrails as the vessel hung on the edge of the flip. Then, slowly, the world began to move. The deck groaned as the weight of the new water pulled against the tilt. The list dropped to 18 degrees, then 17. It was a sickening, sluggish motion, like a giant waking from a deep sleep. The vessel leveled out at 12 degrees, but the stern was now sitting dangerously low. The waves of the Mediterranean were washing over the aft deck, swirling around the scorched remains of the flight deck. The vessel's CG-71 was now thousands of tons heavier. The freeboard, the distance between the water and the deck, was less than 1 meter at the stern. Every wave that hit the vessel sent a fresh wash of salt water over the jagged metal of the torpedo wound. The smell of the sea was everywhere now, cold and pervasive, mixing with the lingering stink of the fire. In the Combat Information Center, the sailors felt the vessel level out. They didn't cheer, they knew the math. They were deeper in the water, and their structural integrity was a question mark. The vessel was a collection of patches and prayers, held together by the skill of the damage control teams and the luck of the sea. The vibrations of the single functioning engine felt weaker now, a fading pulse in a broken body. Above them, the military helicopter circled like a lonely sentinel. Its fuel was running low, the warning lights on the instrument panel glowing, a soft, insistent amber. The pilot, Jenkins, looked at the vessel below. From her altitude, the naval warship looked like a silver needle floating in a pool of ink. The oil slick was a massive, dark shape that stretched toward the horizon. There were no other ships in sight. "Bridge, military helicopter," Jenkins called. "We are at bingo fuel. We have to head for the coast in 10 minutes. Is there any sign of the strike group?" The commander looked at the shattered radar screens. They were dark. The long-range communications were still out, the antennas likely destroyed by the fire. They were a ghost ship, floating in a blind spot of the world's most crowded sea. "Nothing on our end, military helicopter," the commander replied. "Hold as long as you can. We are still here." The sun was gone now, and the Mediterranean was a void of black water. The wind began to pick up, a cold breeze that carried the scent of a coming storm. The waves were getting higher, their white crests visible in the faint light of the vessel's emergency lanterns. Every time a wave hit the stern, the vessel shuddered, a metallic clank echoing through the hull. The vessel was reaching its final depth, not beneath the waves, but at the very limit of what steel and spirit could endure. 5:15 in the evening. The central Mediterranean was a black, lightless void. The searchlights of the destroyer, DDG-87, USS Mason, finally cut through the oily smoke. The cruiser was a dark, tilted shape against the horizon. The air was freezing now. It carried the sharp smell of cold salt and the lingering stink of scorched metal. The hull groaned as the first rescue ship came into position alongside the wounded giant. The Mason slowed to a crawl. Its white beams swept over the USS Leyte Gulf. The light revealed a nightmare of twisted steel and blackened paint. The cruiser's stern was a ruin. The flight deck was gone. The Mediterranean was washing over the aft deck with every heavy swell. The list remained at 12 degrees, a permanent and dangerous tilt toward the dark water. "Prepare for towing," the captain of the Mason ordered over the bridge-to-bridge circuit. A pneumatic line gun fired from the destroyer's deck with a sharp puff of gray smoke. A thin white messenger line arched through the air. It landed across the cruiser's forward deck, slick with oil and freezing spray. 6 sailors grabbed the line and pulled together with everything they had left. Their hands were raw. Their faces were pale under the harsh glare of the searchlights. They hauled in the wet cord by hand. Slowly, the heavy steel towing hawser emerged from the black water. It was 3 inches of braided steel. It felt like a frozen serpent. They secured the eye of the cable to the forward bits with a massive steel pin. "Line is fast," the report went out. The mason began to pull. The cable went taut as a guitar string. It rose out of the water, shedding a curtain of white spray. The cable hummed with a low, vibrating note that felt like a warning. The Leyte Gulf bucked. The ship resisted the movement of the tow. Thousands of tons of internal water shifted with a sound like thunder. The ship groaned. It was a deep, metallic scream of overstressed frames and twisting bulkheads. A single strand of the steel cable snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The sailors dove for cover as the metal whipped across the deck. The cable held, but the tension was at its absolute limit. The cruiser began to move. The speed was only 2 knots. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dark. Inside the ship, the damage control teams were still fighting. They were shoring up the bulkheads between the flooded and dry spaces. The wooden beams were wet and under immense pressure. Every creak of the timber was a threat of total collapse. The medical team moved the wounded to the mess deck for safety. The space was lit by the dim, green glow of chemical sticks. The floor was tilted. The wounded were strapped into their litters. No one spoke. They only listened to the sound of the hull. The Mediterranean was calmer now, the wind dropping to a whisper, but the sea remained heavy and cold. Every wave that hit the bow sent a fresh shudder through the ship. The tow line remained taut, connecting the 2 vessels in a bond of steel. The Mason and the Leyte Gulf were a single organism now. The surface tension was literal. The ship was held up by physics and the thin steel of internal walls. The captain stood on his bridge and watched the white wake of the destroyer. He felt every vibration in the soles of his boots. He knew the ship was tired. The steel was tired. The men were exhausted. "Steady at 2 knots, the Mason reported. "We are heading for Naval Station Rhoda. ETA is 48 hours. 48 hours was a lifetime for a ship with its back broken. The captain looked at his watch. 5:45 in the evening. The first stars were appearing in the cold eastern sky. They were no longer fighting a submarine. They were fighting the weight of the ocean. The Mediterranean was vast and deep. It was waiting for a single mistake or a single failed weld. But the line held. The cruiser moved forward. The long, slow limp toward safety had finally begun. The smell of the oil slick followed them like a shadow. It was a black trail on a black sea. The helicopter had returned, followed them like a shadow. It was a black trail on a black sea. The helicopter had returned to the deck of the Mason. The sky was empty and silent. The only sound was the humming of the towing cable. "Hold the course," the captain whispered to the empty air. He was talking to the ship itself. The Leyte Gulf responded with a low, metallic moan from deep in its gut. It was still afloat. It was still fighting. The Mediterranean would have to wait another day for its prize. 6:30 in the evening. The central Mediterranean Sea. The USS Leyte Gulf groaned as it moved through the cold, black, dark. The cruiser was a shattered silhouette, wreathed in the faint, white mist of its own cooling steam. The smell of the oil slick was fading, replaced by a biting, northern wind that tasted of salt. The water around the hull was deep and silent, hiding the grave of the Russian submarine. On the bridge, the captain looked at the casualty report under a dim red light. 7 sailors were killed in action. 24 were wounded. 1 cruiser was nearly lost to the weight of the sea. The price of the engagement was written in blood and scorched steel, but the Russian Kilo-class submarine was gone, its pressure hull crushed into fragments. The threat to the Mediterranean shipping lanes had been neutralized. The tow line from the USS Mason remained taut, a silver wire against the darkness. The 2 ships moved at a steady speed of 3 knots toward the coast of Sicily. Every hour was a victory over the rising tide inside the hull. The damage control teams remained at their stations, their faces gray with exhaustion. They sat on the tilted deck, listening to the rhythmic thud of the last working pump. The Mediterranean was quiet once again. The roar of the torpedoes and the scream of the missile launches were memories. The only sound was the hull cutting through the small, rhythmic waves. The stars were bright above, cold and indifferent to the violence below. The sea had reclaimed the Russian boat, but the Leyte Gulf had refused to follow. The mission was complete. The cruiser had held the line, even as its own spine was twisted. The sunrise would find them closer to a friendly port, under the cover of the Sixth Fleet. The battle for the depths was over. Silence fell across the water, heavy and absolute.